Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. So we are back with another edition of Career Conversations. That's our irregular edition of conversation with people who are there in the industry, people who are working with marquee employers like McKinsey, Bain, Dalberg, BCG, the Big Four, Goldman Sachs, Amazon, which is good companies from all sectors. But today, the focus of the conversation would be on social impact consulting because uh, that's an industry and a theme on which we get the most number of questions, which is how to prepare, how to crack these interviews, which case books to refer to. So we have invited our mentor, Mr. Debashish Roy Choudhury, uh, who is a friend and a batchmate from undergrad. But I'll let him give his introduction. But he has been working with Dalberg for some time now as a management consultant. And the intent through this conversation is to ask him 4 or 5 very pointed questions on how to prepare for impact consulting and also his interview experience and journey with Dalberg. Over to you, Debashish, on your introduction, and then we can take it ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, indeed. I studied in Shahid Sukhdev College of Business Studies along with Sarthak here. And post that, I worked at KPMG in financial due diligence. I did a stint with a learning and development firm based out of Singapore for a while. Um, and post that, I did my master's at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology in international management. And I found myself here at Dalberg. And I joined as a business development intern, straight out of. I applied off campus,
Okay.
but I interned for about 3 months, and then I opted to not join as an associate consultant, but actually a business development associate
Okay.
for the then uh, regional head, Gaurav Gupta.
Okay.
So I worked with him closely for a year, which involved a mix of many things. So it was a great experience because I did a lot of projects,
Mhm.
which any consultant would have done, but I also assisted him in a lot of business development. So got to see how he operates,
Okay.
how does he win business, how does he talk to people, how does he engage with a lot of folks. So that was also a really bonus experience, if you will. But yeah, it's been 2.5 years here now. Yeah, and going steady.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Devashish. Pretty illustrious background, like I was hinting. But the first question which comes to my mind, which is, there with a lot of people who have a remote interest in consulting, which is what is the difference between social impact consulting and management consulting? Let's talk about it firstly in terms of the interview process, if you can share that.
Sure. So I think in terms of an interview process, it's not very different.
Hmm.
At least in terms of the steps, you have an aptitude test, right? Typically, and then 3 to 4 rounds of interviews, usually going from a consultant level interview. So I've also done a couple of interviews a while back now, but so you do one round of those, then it goes to manager level interviews, and then lastly you have partner level rounds. So it's not very different, I'd say. What
Hmm.
differs is obviously the content, um, a little bit.
Okay.
So in terms of the aptitude test, I mean, it's fairly similar. It's not very different from what you'd see from a Bain or BCG or something. But I think when it comes to the interviews, the guesstimates are very tailored to the impact sector.
Hmm.
Um, Now, I feel like for a lot of the other firms, especially if you're going through B school, the formula is sort of set in that you may have a guesstimate in your first round and then you get like a little elaborate case or a guesstimate situation. Here, it's not quite, at least speaking for Dalberg, it can be a bit more varied. And I think for a lot of other impact firms, to the best of my knowledge, it's not quite as predictable because most of the consultants have a fair bit of flexibility in what they want to test the candidate on. So we
Right.
tend to pick up cases. We tend to do cases even from round one itself. It will
Okay.
have a component of guesstimate on it. And you may actually find a flipped script where a partner asks you a really wacko guesstimate as his first question.
Got it.
So it's a bit more unpredictable. That makes it exciting. Also, I can imagine it creates a bit of nerves here. You don't really know what you're stepping into. Um, from a content perspective is where it differs the most. I think while so I full disclosure, I didn't prepare really well for any consulting cases before I jumped into this opportunity to intern, where I also had to face the brunt of questions and weird cases.
Hmm.
Uh, but I think on some level, so while a main case comes down to classifying it into a growth case, a profitability case, so on and so forth, there are these archetypes, right? And then you have to peel back and figure out.
Yeah.
I think for an impact case, it's actually very different. And a lot of it comes down to a bit of common sense. Uh,
Okay.
it is about how do you framework a complex social challenge, right?
Hmm.
So if I were to ask you uh, a question that I used to use in the past as an interviewer was, if you're working in a, if you have your had to consult and advise on a midday meal program, like a non-profit is running a midday meal program, you know,
Hmm.
what are some things you think about? And
Okay.
I'd give them a challenge problem statement based on that. Now, the thing is, it's not hinged on your knowledge of knowing what a midday meal is, but if you're
Hmm.
thinking of a framework right off the bat, you're not going to make it.
Yeah, very true.
You need to push yourself to actually wear multiple hats
Hmm.
sometimes. Sometimes it's the hat of the person who's doing the scheme. Sometimes it's a beneficiary. Sometimes it's the funder,
Hmm.
right? So
Hmm.
these various hats, you need to figure out what is the right hat to wear. And sometimes there are a couple of hats you need to wear during the case. And that's how you sort of figure that out. Similarly, and this is one type of problem. You could have someone ask you, okay, I'm trying to do a healthcare solution for women. Okay. Now,
Hmm.
how do you ensure that I keep the right gender lens in mind?
Okay. Got it.
This is an example, right?
Hmm.
So I think the key for something like this is do a lot of case practice. Do the
Hmm.
typical case practice that's out there, because I think what it helps is it helps build a muscle for first principles thinking
Very true.
and intuitive structuring. But this is where the other side of it comes in. You need to be at least a little interested in the space, because
Hmm.
otherwise it's very hard to come up with things to say and
Got it.
smart things to say.
Hmm. Very interesting. I think what you're trying to hint at is you have to do a stakeholder analysis of the problem at hand. Uh, if it's, let's say it's
That
some,
works in some cases.
yeah, yeah. If it's a midday meal, then you talk about the students, their POV, you talk about the school, you talk about the admin team, you talk about the supplier who's supplying that midday meal to the students, and the financial ramifications of that. Understood. Very
Now, see,
interesting.
this works in this context when
Ah,
when you pick this angle. But the minute I ask you to do an impact evaluation of this,
yeah,
now
that's totally
suddenly
different.
the whole script is flipped. So I
Yeah,
think
very
the
true.
problem is creating archetypes is not intuitive for this sector, because honestly, on a day-to-day for us also, it isn't as intuitive as figuring out, okay, there's a revenue, there's a cost model, there's this thing. I know consultants obviously in MBBs work on various different solutions,
Hmm.
but I think that the complexity is in that social problems are difficult to solve for.
Got it.
Uh, yeah.
Very interesting. And now, if I want us to, differentiate between these two sectors, which is social impact and management consulting, basis the work that you do, the kind of clients that you work with, the kind of problems you solve, what would you say on that?
Got it. So I think I've heard this question from interviewees also a couple of times over the years.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for people who, and understandably so, don't know much of the sector, and there is a fair bit of ambiguity around it. I think it's important to understand that social impact consultants are not change makers.
Hmm.
They help change makers, right?
Okay.
And that's a very important distinction. So our clients would range anywhere from people who, from the private sector to development finance institutions like the World Bank, USAID. It could range to, nonprofits. We've done a
Hmm.
fair few work with nonprofits directly. Problem statements can vary on a lot of things,
Hmm.
uh, and different sectors, as you can imagine. But I think the key thing is tend to take up work that creates a net positive in the right?
Yeah.
Now you could come up and say, why is developing an eye care solution for a private sector person, company a positive, or like, why is that an impact problem? It is, right? Because you're trying to create a healthcare problem, a healthcare solution
Yeah.
to a problem that can actually scale to a lot of people. And in that, there's an opportunity to create influence, right? And create those best practices with a private sector supplier about
Got
how do you reach various communities. And I think that's a powerful position to be in sometimes. So a lot of people come back and say, I'm not sure, we're not doing any groundwork. Why doesn't Dalberg fund things? Or why doesn't this impact firm or that impact firm, why don't they fund stuff? But that's not the job, right?
Yeah.
It's important to remember that we are not change makers. We are trying to help change accelerate, trying to get change up off the ground.
Hmm.
um yeah, but so in that, of course, a lot of the problem statements are a bit different because there's a lot more, I feel, a connection to the kind of end beneficiary
Yeah.
of services.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that ends up creating a bit more complexity, because it's also not just about making sure something reaches someone, but how do you make sure? So say if there's an agriculture product, right, that you're
Hmm.
trying to finesse for smallholder farmers.
Hmm.
Our work is not just telling you how do you reach smallholder farmers, it's about telling you how do you reach that women farmer.
Yeah.
It's about us telling you how do you reach low income farmers, not just the rich farmers. How do you create a product for them? So
Hmm.
that is where I think it's a bit more nuanced.
Hmm.
Um,
Got
but
it.
otherwise, yeah, I think yeah, that's basically where it leave it.
Understood. And now a very important question which stems from the question we were discussing before, which is,
Mhm.
how can a college graduate or an early professional who's very interested in impact consulting, how can they prepare? I mean, what case books or what resources should they get their hands on to cultivate their interest and inclination towards this space? And would you prescribe them to do, the standard case practice as well?
Yeah. So this is an interesting question, and I remember having this challenge when I was also applying, because there aren't many resources out there. A couple of case books have a few case studies from. So I remember ISB definitely has ISB's case book has a couple of cases on impact consulting. Not many, maybe one or two.
Hmm.
Um, you should definitely reach out to people on LinkedIn when you're trying to go through this. But my general advice also is you should follow or at least look up a lot of the top leadership at these firms on LinkedIn,
Okay.
because sometimes they post a lot of advice or they've
Hmm.
done podcasts of this sort. And because I was trying to be Gaurav's BD intern, I remember stalking him on LinkedIn, and he actually had this very helpful series of posts which he used to do on case questions, and they were
Okay.
completely wacko, but they were all tied to the impact sector.
Hmm.
And obviously, he never asks those questions, but they're very interesting to open your mind up, right?
Okay.
It gives you a taste of what could the question go to,
Hmm.
and honestly, you might look at them and say, "Hey, this is insane, right? How do you answer something like this?" But
Yeah.
honestly, you can face these questions very often, especially in the partner rounds. So I definitely recommend going through some of their profiles for some of this intel, and even just generally having a look at some of the reports created by a lot of these firms, not just Dalberg particularly, is generally very helpful because you get a sense of the problem statements. I think
Hmm.
the issue often is you don't know what problem are the firms trying to solve for, right? So
Very.
creating a case around that is very.
Hmm.
So I would actually suggest when there isn't a full defined case, have go and seek those problems out, right? What have these companies worked on? What are some typical problem statements they wrestle with? And then while you may not have an exact solution, practice. What could be a solution, right? Yeah, and this is one of those instances where I'd say reading up a bit about the sector actually helps a lot, because it's very difficult to come in and not know what a midday meal is and then answer my case question. You
Yeah.
can't read about everything in the world, and you should definitely, when you're doing an interview, use your interviewers as a source of information. And most cases are structured in a way where we are very well prepared to help give you prompts as compared to any other situation. But definitely being interested in the sector, reading up about it, reading up the kind of work that people do is very important.
Yeah.
um, otherwise, in terms of prep, I think you should definitely do the basic uh, uh, consulting prep as well, like knowing estimates, knowing how to market size something.
Got it.
These are like crucial skills. You don't know where it'll come in handy, but it'll definitely come in handy. So this is something which I'd recommend. Practicing with other people is a good idea when you don't have solutions.
Hmm.
So I recommend doing that.
Got it.
Um, yeah.
Interesting. And all of us know that management consulting firms look for spikes, be it academic, be it work eccentric, be it extracurriculars. Is there any nuance when it comes to CV shortlisting for impact consulting roles? Do they necessarily look for prior work ex with NGOs or foundations, or is that, not a deterrent?
So I think it's a good to have, but it's not a must have in any sense. I didn't have any when I was applying.
Hmm.
I can speak from that. Generally, I don't think this is because I mean it's not necessary that the best impact consultant has to come from a space where they worked in impact.
Hmm.
Because there are many different skill sets you can bring to the kind of problem. So, for instance, I bring a finance
Hmm.
background from KPMG to this, and that's actually proved very valuable in a lot of different scenarios. So, whether it's philanthropic fundraising or some other financing related blended finance aspect, right? So,
Hmm.
I don't think that's necessary. But from a CV perspective, as you said, spikes is generally what everyone will look at: academic spikes, work experience spikes. I think generally. Academic spikes is focused on a fair bit these days. Work experience, if you have a bit of diversity, it helps. And if it's at least tied to something similar to consulting, it helps
Okay.
for sure. If you come in from a very different sector, it's actually really hard because the challenge with so in a consulting sector, you can always leverage a lot of business experience.
Hmm. Yeah.
Right, even if you come in from a different like a banking sector, there's a lot of business experience you can bring into that. Here you actually need a bit more consulting experience because here you want to maximize the impact story when you come in as a that's the learning you need to get in when you get in the firm, not how to be a better problem solver. So it's actually important to be a bit more structured when you're coming in. So if you have worked in something similar to consulting or sort of that has which uses the same basic problem solving skill set, structuring skill set, communication skill set, then that's great. That I think is a huge bonus for something like this. Yeah.
Awesome. And one last question to you, which is, which firms can an impact consulting aspirant target who wants to build a career in India beyond Dalberg?
So I couldn't hear the last part
Yeah.
of your question.
So, which firms can an impact consulting aspirant target beyond Dalberg if they want to build a career in India?
Okay, so I mean there are a lot of great firms, and it really depends on where do you see yourself, and I do recommend reading about all of these firms because some of them and a lot of aspirants actually are coming in to do a lot of impact, right? So I mean the profile of one firm, you shouldn't make this decision based on who is more popular versus who is not as popular. You should really do your research around the kind of work they do. For instance, Samagra is a very interesting work working directly with the government. Very interesting space. Not something that, for instance, Dalberg does on a recurrent basis. So Samagra, that is, a part and parcel of their daily, right? So I think that's a very interesting space you could consider. Satwa also does a lot of work with CSR, for instance, and they're developing a lot of product innovations,
Okay.
which are quite interesting to look at if you're particularly fond of that. Dalberg does a lot of great work with folks like the World Bank, USAID, larger global projects, which can be very interesting, more focused on customized solutions. Um, more the typical strategy consulting model is probably what you'd find here. And I know there are a couple of other, I mean, FSG has started uh, hiring as well in India quite a bit more robustly. And other than that, I mean, I would say you shouldn't just think of it from a impact consulting perspective and limit yourself to that. I think there's a lot of impact finance space which uses a lot of the same skill sets, and I think those are many firms, honestly, where you could actually bring in a lot of and learn a lot in finance space, which I think is probably one of the most interesting impact spaces that will only get bigger in India. So yeah, this is broadly. I don't know if it answers your question, but I
No, it
that's
definitely does. But thank you so much for this conversation. This was a very good to do, a roadmap of sorts of somebody who's wanting to break into impact consulting or let's say interview with Dalberg. But thank you so much on everybody's behalf.
pleasure.